Oh, so Millie, Lucy, and is he one from the right? Okay.
Welcome to the semi-final of Joynt 2020. I believe the motion that we're doing is return on equity. So the exact wording of that is this House would prohibit banks from offering executives contracts where remuneration is tied to return on equity. I'll be your chair today. My name is Connor. For those of you that don't know that, excellent. Without any further ado, I'd like
banking practices found that banks aggressively exploited consumers who lacked the intricate financial knowledge it takes to spot predatory behavior that banks take on in order to increase returns. We cannot let banks get away with preying on vulnerable consumers through risky profit-driven behavior. We must stop the practice of tying remuneration to the return of equity. We're going to win this debate by proving to you that we best improve financial practice in the long term through 3 points. Firstly, explaining how perverse incentives act on CEOs under the status quo. Secondly, explaining how these incentives manifest in policy that hurts consumers. And finally, telling you how this increases risky lending behavior and long-term financial volatility. By way of setup, we bring you a few things. The first thing is to explain what these executive contracts look like under the status quo. That's things like banks paying salaries, bonuses, but also paying out equity and shares proportionately tied to a bank's return on equity. Note that that return on equity is the ratio of the bank's profit to market value. So to increase that return on equity, you want to increase the bank's profits as much as possible. On our comparative, what we prefer is CEOs who get fixed pay contracts, or we can additionally add things like bonuses based on consumer satisfaction and employee satisfaction. Note that what we say is under status quo, even though some banks may choose not to tie CEO pay to return on equity, a norm does exist and CEOs are measured against the performance of other bank CEOs that are tied to this policy. What we're able to provide is a total reset of that financial industry, which means you don't filter down bad behavior to all employees and all banks. Let's look at how CEOs act on these incentives. And the first thing we tell you is that under proportional pay, they do get sizable salaries, but the largest proportion of their payment is bonuses that is tied to ROE. So you might get $500K in salary, but $200 million if you meet targets. The second $2 million, sorry. The second thing to say, I wrote zeros. Incentives to create profit in short term exist to get that bonuses. So the first thing we tell you is that structure of that bonus is often on a quarterly basis. So you meet those targets every 3 months. The second thing to say, there's specific targets they have to meet in order to get that bonus. So the profit of the total bank needs to be 400 million in order for you to get that quarterly bonus. The conclusion of this point is to say that there is an incentive to make as much of a profit as possible, but importantly, it plays out on those short-term basis. So you need to be continuously hitting those targets in order to continuously get your pay. The important thing to note here, though, is that if you're approaching the end of a term where a bonus is at stake and you're just short of making a financial target, you are likely to make a big profit in a very short amount of time with increasingly risky policy, increasingly bad behavior. We tell you that's harmful. The fourth thing we tell you here under CEOs, though, is that when you have an incentive to increase profit as much as possible, you are likely to shift towards middle-class consumers at the risk of poorer people or elderly people who might be riskier lenders, but people that need financial assistance. That happens less on our side of the house. Let's look at how these incentives manifest in actual bad policy that hurts consumers. I think the first thing we just flagged to here is that markets are incredibly stacked against consumers, and that happens on both sides. The first thing we say is that bank usage is compulsory. You can't opt out. If you are paid an income, you need a bank account. If you have a mortgage or you pay rent, you need to be within the financial institutions. But the second thing to say is that people don't have an inherent understanding of financial products. Talking about money is scary. They use jargon. You have choice overload, but you just trust banks to simplify choices for you. But the second thing under this is that there's just a lot of legal stuff at play that you do just have to be in tune with the financial industry to ever perfectly understand. It's things like fine print, it's things like contracts. But thirdly, there's regulatory capture by banks, which means that the market is always stacked against you. Banks have power over politics. They provide commentary on economic policy, so politicians have an incentive to keep in the good books of banks. Banks make donations in the US for congressmen, which is why the Consumer Financial Board is undermined. But also John Key, literally after leaving politics, is sitting on the board of ANZ. That is proof of how intertwined those communities are. So consumers are always on the back foot. What are the harms of this? The first thing to say is consumers get pushed worse products. At best, those products are just unnecessary and make them take on loans they don't have to, but at worst, they are actively harmful. When you go to a bank, every time you go in, they ask you, hey, are you interested in taking on a credit card and taking on those interest risks? They move you into different KiwiSaver funds. They might have more growth returns that are better for the bank, but riskier for your long-term savings. But note that they also often hype up the benefits of different policies while they brush over the cost. So they don't tell you that the interest fees are going to be enormously high if you miss a payment, but it's fine because in the get-go, they're small. The second thing we tell you, though, is that specifically profit incentives mean that CEOs pressure the lenders in their banks to do things like encourage predatory loaning practice or predatory mortgage agreements. Note that often these kinds of setups are ones where the interest rate is low to begin with, but if you miss payments, that interest rate ratchets up, the bank is able to take on all of your collateral, and you are left in a far worse position than you were before because you are literally unable to pay back those loans. I'll take a POI now.
Do you not think that these individuals also have an incentive to know that their income won't drop precipitously by like 80% and ensure a stable income to some extent, so you don't avoid the excesses of these practices?
CEOs get paid such a large base salary, it's unclear why we need to pay them millions more. But there are also lots of other incentives why you might want to be the CEO of a successful bank. It looks really fucking good on your CV if you ran the best bank in New Zealand, right? You can go into bigger business practices in the future that pay you far more in the ways they like. We just say specifically for banking, when it's people's monies and entire economies on the line, you ought not to encourage the kind of predatory behavior that side has to stand for. Let's look at how this increases risky lending behavior and long-term financial volatility. And note that we've already explained that in the short term, there are significant harms of encouraging profit-driven behavior, but this practice puts financial markets at risk going into the future. Firstly, banks engage in higher risk lending options because the higher the risk is, the worse someone's credit rating is, the higher interest rate you can charge them, the more money you can collect from that person. But the second thing they do is that they encourage collusion to on-sell things like collectivized debt obligations to make sure they get those returns. And look, we saw the global financial crisis. I don't need to impact this point much more than we already have, but it looks like immense job loss. It looks like market collapse. That's something that happens when the kinds of incentives acting on CEOs are always the kinds of behavior that lend towards risky behavior. And note that this incentive exists, so it doesn't matter if that side of the house tries to regulate the housing market, right? Banks are able to find other avenues to increase risky behavior. They might do things like they do in the US now, which is collectivized loan obligations or collecting student loan debt, right? These incentives will always exist on banks if you tell them that the number one priority for their CEOs who run financial policy is to increase the way that they lend risky behavior to increase their profits. We tell you, you are not able to regulate the entire world on their side of the house. The best practice is to change those incentives and make sure that CEOs are only putting in practice policies that go for long-term stable growth, which is not what they stand for on our side of the house. At the end of this speech, what we tell you is we're able to reset the financial market in a way that puts the ball back in the court of consumers. That's why we're proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech and welcome up the first speaker from the gating team.
think it's interesting that Umbar answered Karan's POI by saying that there's still like a huge pressure to be the best CEO, that you still want to be the leader of the most profitable bank. Because that's true. CEOs are psychopaths. To the extent that predatory loaning is really profitable, you still want to be the most profitable bank. You still want to like get the most possible return, and a lot of those incentives still play out. The difference here is that when you have a bad year, when you fuck up, you make that really risky investment that causes the bank to have really, to lose a lot of money, you don't feel that pain because your salary is fixed. The incentive to be profitable is the same in both sides. We just have an added incentive to not be risky, to not lose money. Okay, 2 points in today's debate. Firstly, how do we make individuals like lending practices less risky, clashing a lot with the content that Umbar gave you. Secondly, I'll tell you about how the lack of bonus-based remuneration leads to greedy CEOs turning to fraud and collusion, also clashing a lot with Umbar's stuff. Also, a very quick bit of setup. We think that we largely agree with that conception of the debate, right? Banks have stable, reliable, safe sources of income. It's probably about making them less risky and causing them to stick to their bread and butter, mortgages, not do predatory things. Okay, I will integrate a lot of my rebuttal, but first let's have a look at what we heard from them. So Umbar's main mechanism for why you're driven to do risky things is that bonuses often short term. What's our response to this? The first thing is that we think that at the executive level, you're probably smart enough to realize that just one quarter alone isn't enough to sustain your lifestyle, right? You have a cocaine habit, you have to sustain that until you're 50. You literally work in finance, you're able to do the math at how much your lifestyle costs and how much income you need to sustain over the next few years. So you're not just going to be happy with a huge quarter and then lose your job and not make any money and survive only on your salary, right? You still clearly value money, you still place a lot of value on it because you work in finance. So you're not just happy to have that one big quarter or to lose that year. And also, we think a lot of short-term pressures play out on both sides, right? To the extent that you are shareholder driven, you have to please the shareholders at their meeting in order to not get fired or in order to get a promotion to the next level up in the executive office. There's still huge incentives there. The rest of Umbar's speech was largely just impacting, right? To the extent that we can tell you that the profit incentive still plays out, there's still huge incentives to engage in predatory loaning practice. As I said in my intro, if you are a psychopath, you're not going to suddenly decide you're really nice, you want to be really great to your customers, you want to not engage in those practices if that's the most profitable route. Okay, how does this make lending practices less risky? And the context here is that, as Umbar told you, this typically makes up a huge portion of your total salary package. So your base salary will be very low, and it's often just 10 or 20% of your actual total salary because your bonus is so much. What's the alternative then to having bonuses? Well, the first thing to say is that banks still probably want to have good incentives on employees, right? They want their executives to make profit because that's what the shareholders and that's what the customers who use the bank want. They want a safe, they want returns on their money that they invest. So that's likely to come through paths such as promotions or pay raises, right? So if you have a particularly good year as chief financial officer, you get promoted by the board up to the next level. All that kind of, those promotions you get. But importantly, it's incredibly rare to get demoted, right? Because at the executive level, it's a bit of an old boys club, right? There's an incredibly small number of people. We're talking about the top 0.001%. Everyone knows each other, and everyone's quite good friends with each other. You have all that networking, right? You went to Harvard with them. They were in your class. They're in your fraternity. You destroyed restaurants together on drunken nights out. So you have all those long-standing friendships. Also, you also just have a huge amount of power to cover up mistakes, right? Because investments aren't easy. There's no objective measure of what the best investment is. So you can say it was the best possible decision at the time. It just played out really poorly. When you're eligible for promotion, you can justify that by saying it was the best decision at the time. And it just didn't happen to work out in this case. The absolute worst case is that even if you do go really badly, you probably just move to another bank, right? Because the people at that bank, you've probably had good returns in the past that you can lean on to hide that one bad year. The other thing is that you can probably just bail before the problems emerge, right? Because often these things are long term. So if you do bail, you don't suffer consequences back at the bank. So that means, and the final mechanism here is that banks do have quite large pools of funds. They are willing to justify making risky bets, right? You don't have to. It's not particularly hard to persuade the board that you're doing the best thing when making a risky bet. So that means that for an individual, the incentive on you is to make riskier bets. Because when there is a good year and there is a high reward, you get that promotion or you get that pay raise. And that sticks around because you have sticky wages. When you fail, when that investment goes badly, when that risky bet doesn't pay off, nothing really changes for you, right? The consequence is very limited. It's incredibly rare to get demoted or to get a permanent pay cut. In our world, what happens? Look, we think people are generally just more risk averse when the consequences actually affect them, right? If I'm playing with other people's money, I don't really care too much if I lose it, but if I have a stake in the outcome, that matters a lot more to me. The main means of competition for these people is money, right? You want to have the most money. You want to have live the Wolf of Wall Street lifestyle and have the nicest car, the biggest private yacht, the biggest private jet, right? Also, we think that diminishing marginal utility still applies here, right? To the extent that you are already rich, having a second yacht isn't that much of a benefit to your lifestyle, but losing out on income matters a lot more, right? Because you're spending that money. So, that means if your income drops, that means you have to change your lifestyle. That means you have to make cuts. You value that a lot more than just missing out on extra benefits. I'll take that POI.
So I think your case suggests that at our worst, the profit incentive decreases, so you take on less risky behavior. The global financial crisis was caused by the amount of risky lending that took place. I think your best case is pretty realistic. Why is decreasing the risk of financial collapse so bad?
Well, it's not, right? We're literally telling you to decrease the risk because you don't want to be having the consequences of that on yourself. You care about your own income a lot more than you care about the bank broadly, so you don't make those risky bets because when they don't pay off, you lose out. Okay. Also, the other mechanism we have here is that when people's incomes are affected, that means there's an incentive to assign blame, right? Because the other executives are all really angry that you have also caused them to have to sell their private yacht or to downgrade their house to a slightly smaller mansion. So they have to pin it on someone because they want someone to take the blame. They don't want them to get away with cutting their income and affecting their lifestyle. So the end of this point, what we've shown you is that having remuneration acts as a counterbalance to those risky incentives on banks, to the profit incentive to make as much money. You lose out when that risk fails. You actually feel the pain of the bank collapsing. That means there's also just more of an incentive to stick to legal requirements, right? It's banks' path to being safe, stable investments is pretty clear. You don't have to do anything particularly innovative, right? You just stick to your mortgages and stick to those. That's hugely important because all the people that have invested money in your bank are probably just regular people, right? They're the people who are most likely to lose out when the bank collapses. They're the people that are most likely to lose out when treasury loans occur. Okay, Karan's going to tell you a lot about why the lack of remuneration is likely to lead to collusion, but the mechanism that they missed when they were talking about this is that you can just get those kickbacks from collusion. So the extent that that's the only way for you to increase your bonus and to get a short-term bonus, that's the incentive that plays out on you. That's why you turn to collusion more on their side, not on our side. Incredibly proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech. I'd like to welcome up the second speaker on the Affirmative team.
Best case from Liam's case just right now. They just prove that their side gets incentives to not make risky loans. But that doesn't change the fact that banks, because they want profit, will start preying on vulnerable people, like old people or people who just don't understand financial instruments, and suck the money out of them to increase their profits. So their best case doesn't even respond to the worst harms on our side. I'm going to talk to you further about three things in my speech. Firstly, about this incentive structure that they want to achieve versus what we proposed in terms of weighing up, the CEOs being fired versus CEOs losing profit. Secondly, about consumer protection, something that they've missed here and impacting that way further. And then going on to their side about risky lending and explain why it's far more likely on their side to create volatility in the market because you're focusing on profit and the norm hasn't changed. Firstly, let's talk about incentives. What did we tell you? We told you there's a very simple incentive on their side of the house. If you want to get a higher profit so you can get more money, no thank you. The second point that they have not responded to adequately is the fact that this is done in the short term, right? So it's done in terms of on a quarterly basis or specific targets the CEO has to achieve. The response is, oh, it's not enough to only worry about the first quarter, that you need to worry about all future quarters. But the point here is that you don't expect the bank to fail in like immediately after that quarter. So you're always pushing back that risk further and further and further. But it's about the collectivization of wealth over time. So you still want to do this to get the bonus and then get the next bonus and then get the next bonus. There's no point missing out on one bonus and then getting the one that's further away, because that's still, again, the same amount of money. You get far more money if they try and get it every quarter. The second thing is that because people in general are short term, they're likely to think this way. And it's especially, just listen to their responses, right? That you might have a lifestyle that requires like a high spending, like you might have a cocaine addiction. If you have a cocaine addiction, you want the money immediately, right? So those kinds of lifestyle incentives mean that you are likely to continue moving in the way that we talked to you about. Let's talk about the incentives to be profitable and the incentives not to lose money. Firstly, Liam can't respond by saying, oh, there'll still be a norm to be profitable because that's how you get that's how you get brand name and that's how you get money. Firstly, they haven't responded to the fact that the norms change now, right? So bank successes aren't now measured by profit anymore, but they're measured by a more long-term thinking. The bank's success is not on those quarterly basis. The CEO's success is not on the quarterly basis, but it's on the long-term office. So it's about creating good structures, incentive structures, having community outreach, right? And then people are like, oh, that's a nice bank. And then you got a good consumer satisfaction. You are likely as a CEO to get all the benefits that we propose in terms of having a good name and getting more money by getting better contracts afterwards. No, thank you. But this last thing to say is that it's just more long-term in the way that we've already discussed. Again, they haven't responded to that. Let's talk about the incentive to not lose money by not taking risk. The first point to note here is if you do cause a collapse, you are likely going to be fired. The point here is not sort of contradiction, because you're not going to be fired for like for not increasing profits up to a certain amount. Again, the norm has changed as well. But you're going to be fired for the most harmful things that they want to say on their side. What did Liam say to this? Oh, you're not going to be fired. Why? Because you are chummy with the board and you're chummy with all these other people. The first point is that people in the board and people who have invested money in the bank do not want the bank to fail. The moment you, as a CEO, has caused the bank to fail, there's going to be some repercussions on you. No matter how friendly rich people are, they do ultimately care about the money. But the second point here is that the community will be out to get you, right? Your brand has been destroyed. No one is going to go to a bank which the CEO has failed in another bank, right? They're going to go to a different bank. So the incentives again on banks are not to take the CEO that's completely failed in a certain area. So there are already good incentives for the CEO not to fail and to likely to be fired. The second point they said is, oh, you're likely to cover these up, so therefore you're not going to be fired. Again, the incentive works on our side as well, because then you have the incentive to cover up bad predatory loans or cover up the fact that your bank is going to be very risky in the future. And that's what they did by colluding with ratings agencies. And the collapse happens way into the future. Again, the short-term incentives that we brought to you provide that it's more likely to happen on their side than on our side. Before I move on, yes.
Shareholders already know that if you earn an extra $500 million a year from being predatory, and suddenly a CEO decides they're not going to anymore to be nice, are they going to keep you as the CEO or take you out?
The point is that you should be comparative here, right? If the CEO has a direct incentive to take more risk, slightly more risk than usual, and that the harm is either not going to, they don't think the harm is going to happen to the bank, and they're likely to get those kinds of loans, or it's the fact they don't care about that long term and they want to get short term benefits, that is more likely on your side. To the point that you've asked at POI, that on your side the exact same incentives exist, and I've already handled the incentives on their side. Like, Celine's going to come up and try and collapse this, but still, just notice that in the lots of structural analysis we brought to you at Umbar needs to be responded to and hasn't happened yet. Let's talk now about, I obviously can't move to another bank for all the reasons I brought to you about their brand, for example. Let's talk about consumers' protection. We told you why consumers particularly can't opt out of these things. They don't understand financial language, and you get regulatory capture, right? The moment that on our side you have CEO pay tied to consumer satisfaction and tied to other forms, other metrics as opposed to profit, you're likely to get incentives to protect those consumers, to get those consumers towards you. Again, the conflicting interests on their side mean it's always going to be less likely for the CEO to protect those consumers. Even if the case of the CEO is going to be evil, it's not the case that they're going to be less evil on their side because all the incentives are additionally on their side. What does that mean then, right? Let's impact this. It's just you ruin people's lives. You target old people. You target people who want to buy a house. You give them loans that they can't pay back in the future and lie to them to the extent that they take those loans. That means you literally take homes away from people. You destroy people's pension funds. And that is harm that is spread across the most vulnerable groups of people in society and the people who literally need the protection the most. Finally, let's talk about how this increases risky lending, dealing that with, responding to what we heard from Liam. What Liam said is that if you are risk averse as a CEO, you are not going to take risky loans because you have to then change your lifestyle. Again, that will exist on our side as well, because if you take risky loans and it fails, all of the analysis about how that affects you and your job and the fact you're going to be fired is also on our side. Again, the calculus you have to make is that interest versus the incentives that they provide to get profit. And there's always going to be a clash. That's something that they can't remove in this debate. The other point to note is that it only this doesn't engage with our analysis about how CEOs make that kind of decision, right? It's not that they choose to be risky because they're like, oh, the bank's going to fail in the future, but I don't care. They're making short-term bets, which means that they think that loan's going to pay off. They don't think that the market's going to collapse, because as long as the bubble is rising, they're getting paid, right? And the moment the bubble pops, they've already gathered so much profit, even in the worst cases, where they're able to then retire to a nice island somewhere, right? We saw that happening in the global financial crisis. I mean, giving you analysis to show this is likely to happen as long as you have those kinds of incentives. No, this is a very simple debate about incentives, and they have not mechanistically proven those incentives are very different on our side compared to the impacts on CEOs, to get profit, but on the benefits they want to achieve are simply provided by the CEO being dragged through the media. People don't like that CEO. People aren't going to use that bank. Competition means that the CEO loses their job and can't move to another bank. Very simple analysis to show that CEOs have better incentives on our side, better incentives to protect consumers, and better long-term incentives to protect the market.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech. I'd like to welcome up the second debating speaker.
Let's just take a step back and realize how ridiculous the counter-model alternative they proposed to you was. They told you that CEO incomes should largely be tied to consumer satisfaction. Let me then tell you what actually satisfies consumers. It's when those risky consumers know they can get a cheap loan from the bank that they're unable to pay off, because when they fill out that consumer satisfaction form a month or 2 or 3 months or even a year after getting that loan, they're still satisfied. The implications of that consumer satisfaction often stem years after, or even 2 years after, when they realize they can't start keeping up with those loan repayments. That is really the world that they're trying to propose to you here. And we tell you, you have far more risk on that side of the house than you do on ours. Because what is the comparative? On our side of the house, these executives have a clear, guaranteed drop in income when the performance of their portfolio decreases within that 3 months, 6 months, or 9 months. You get that guaranteed drop. On their side of the house, you have weird consumer satisfaction surveys, but on top of that, the company can also deflect blame. There is no one individual to put that blame on. And yes, you do get that long, prolonged court case, but the individual responsible for those practices doesn't actually have as clear of an incentive, right, to avoid them when they can just deflect, give that blame to the company and be dragged in a long court case where they're not necessarily the person, the individual that is deemed responsible when you have an entire board of executives. This leads me on to my first point about which side of the house actually has a more perverse incentives in terms of taking risk. The first thing to note here is essentially their cases. We have individual incentives that drive worse to be far worse, whereas what we're telling on our side of the house is that these individual incentives actually decrease the risk that as a company, as a bank, is far more perverse. So let's talk to you about why that's the case. Let's use their analysis. Clearly, these banks are in competition with each other. They want a greater market share. What that means then is they're going to want to increase that market share, and in responding to that competition, they want to increase those riskier loans because the people who are riskier, when they get that loan, don't perceive it as them being a liability, but that bank being benevolent to them. But we tell you that these banks are not benevolent actors, right? Because they can compete on things like mortgage repayment rates or interest rates, right? Which means they might give riskier interest rates as an entire bank because that is their incentive under their metric and their world of consumer satisfaction. Why is that then different on an individualized basis? We tell you that the first thing you need to know here is that now individuals are forced to take blame for the actions that they undergo. Why is that the case, right? Because let's look at how this metric plays out. When you are saying that an individual should see, in the big numbers they have, a 10 million or 5 million drop in their salary, someone has to take the hit, right? The whole board can't take the hit. They have to ascribe the blame to the individual that is going to take the hit. In their world, the board can deflect. In their world, maybe all of the board takes a slight hit as opposed to one individual taking a massive hit. Or that board can be in a prolonged court case. What that then means, right, is that for those individuals in charge, perhaps, of being the driving force of those risky and predatory lending practices, right, there is now a direct incentive for them to avoid that because they're going to have to be held accountable. Because, yes, these boards may be an old boys club, but they're not particularly the most loyal places to be. People will ascribe blame to you, so their cuts and their salaries don't get reduced massively. That incentive means that there is going to have to be an individual responsible, which is why you actually have a direct short to medium term interest in terms of how you decrease those lending practices from the people most responsible for them. So what this means then is that we do give an additional individualized incentive that their side of the house can never truly give when these companies have massive amounts of money to put in court cases to deflect blame. They can't provide that to you. And we also give you an immediate incentive that to mitigate some of the short-term harms that they've given to you. The second point is then, how do we actually impact these lending practices? But before I do so, yes.
So, again, if the bonus target is risky for the current market and the CEO is incentivized to make it, doesn't that mean that you are incentivizing them to take this risky behavior?
No, because you don't understand in terms of the consequences of that taking that risky behavior, because clearly all of your impacts were when those things fail, right? And when the bank does collapse. At that point then, there is a clear person to target and there is a clear individualized incentive on them. So we think at best you have a more balanced risk calculus as opposed to your world where that risk calculus is far more perverse. So we're able to give that direct benefit to you. The second point now is how do we actually impact the lending practices of these banks? They're premised so much on their case on predatory lending practices. Let us respond firstly on a mitigatory level, right? We think you can minimize a lot of those excessive predatory practices by having like a minimum equity requirement or a minimum income requirement. So you're not going to give a massive loan to someone who clearly earns $30,000 and then give them a $700,000 loan. So yes, we can regulate to some extent, which is what happened after Wall Street, which is why we have the Australian Commission in the first place. So yes, you can regulate the worst excesses that they claim and have centered so much of their case on. The second thing then to note, right, is clearly it's not, I've already told you about how you often avoid the worst cases in terms of the individualized incentives that I told you. But what really is this case then about? It's not always about the most predatory investments, it's about high risk investments or investments that might be as medium or to low risk, right? That means like investing in a new sunrise industry that might be particularly risky or there is no guaranteed history of return. Or it might mean giving money to people on the margins, right? Where it's not like they can't not pay the money, but they might have a relatively low income that is just above the threshold. In that case, we tell you for the incentives that I gave you before, that the bank as a whole has those perverse incentives to take those high-risk bets. You can't fire a whole board, but you can put blame on the weakest link and to a particular individual to ascribe that to. Versus our world, right, where individual blame has to be ascribed. And this responds to Shah, because when Shah said, oh, well, they can just go to different banks and this, they can get new jobs. But clearly when your returns, as you're like, when you have a base salary, right, and you're not getting those large returns, all of those returns are highly unstable, that also is a direct financial metric that when people see you and are hiring you can say, okay, this guy has really precipitous returns that fluctuates a lot. And that is a clear metric that can be used to improve hiring practices. So at the end of this debate, what we've told you, right, is that you don't actually get the worst of harms and the most predatory excesses that they've centered so much of their case on. A lot of that can go away with regulation, but we told you even at their best, we provide a more balanced incentive and a risk calculus that works to a far greater extent on our side of the house when you actually take into account the reality of how the fallback from these practices actually occurs, right? You can't fire a whole board, but at least when you have an individual accountability mechanism in this old boys club, you're able now to actually put people responsible and make people change their risk calculus, or at the very least, do it in a way that is far more balanced than what they can ever guarantee you on that side of the house. Incredibly proud to negate it.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech. I'd like to welcome up the third affirmative speaker.
I know we're tired on a Monday morning, so let me make this debate really simple for you. Both teams in this debate believe the profit incentive does something for CEOs in terms of changing their risk calculus. We say that the short-term incentive about profit every quarter, about having to meet your targets, is the primary driving influence on people's behavior. That side of the house says that a risk of a big loss sometime in the ethereal future is what's going to drive CEO decision making. Just praise that for a second, right? If you're a CEO, you probably don't make risky decisions that you think are going to go badly, right? Like, you don't think that harm of you losing that money is going to accrue in the future. You're much more driven by the short-term active incentive that acts on you every quarter consistently, rather than ethereal, uncertain harm sometime off in the long distance. That's why those guys lose the debate, because they never respond to what Shah told you, is that those CEOs can keep pushing that risk out and out and out, because they don't need to proceed with that issue when these short-term overriding incentives completely override what that side of the house wants to deliver. We're going to do two things in the speech. One, we're going to talk about what incentives act on CEOs and why the framework that side of the house was just like weird and strangely ludicrous in this debate. Then secondly, we're going to talk about the outcomes of the debate, which we finally heard a response from 6 minutes deep into Karan's speech. Okay, what incentives act on CEOs? We told you that these incentives were short-term incentives. Their response was, well, CEOs are smart enough to act like think in the long term. But note here that they never responded to any of the underlying mechanisms where we actually told you how these compensation packages were designed in order to extract and preference these short-term preferences of consumers. Those were things like, A, actually requiring assessing you both on quarterly targets and yearly targets. But the second thing we told you was it was about hitting a certain number every quarter. When that is an arbitrary number, right? Like when you're not that far away from it and you've got 2 weeks left or like a month left in the quarter or the year, CEOs have really short-term thinking incentives that act on them to hit that specific target. But the third thing we told you was that often these bonuses have a consistent growth narrative. So to get your bonus quarter after quarter, you have to deliver year-on-year growth every quarter. Even if the market's a little bit shaky and like there are just factors beyond the control of you as a CEO that explain why that quarter didn't perform, you still have that incentive. And often to realize your full compensation package, you have to hit all of your targets across that year. So you can't miss a single one of those targets. None of that analysis was responded to that side. They just wanted to hand wave it away rather than actually engage in why those incentives create the overriding drive for performance. Okay, so what was their kind of analysis and their response to this? They said that the negative or downside impact was going to always outweigh the upside impact. The first thing, as I flagged in my introduction, is like we don't think CEOs expect, like when you make financial decisions, particularly in a company as big as a bank, you think you know, like you're in that position because you think you know better than the market. You think you can make the smartest decisions, be the best at your job, be the best at your ability. That means that you're never evaluating this massive downside risk that side of the house wants to talk about. But the second thing is there's often a backstop on these ones, right? Like the CEO has a base compensation of $400,000. So even if they don't claim their $2 million bonus, that probably still pays the mortgage on their house for the year. So they don't get this like weird incentive of perverse loss of income. But thirdly, in the short term, they've already accumulated lots of their bonuses. So even if there was a big risk off into the future, over the 2 or 3 years they were initially in the job, they probably collected a lot of that income anyway and you cashed it out. Okay, what was there? And the final thing we told you is we told you that these CEOs can probably be fired and removed from their jobs. Firstly, there was a bit of confusion in how these things operated. We were primarily talking about senior managers in this debate rather than board members. So shareholders elect the board then decide the employment of the senior managers. That side of the house was like, oh, you can't allocate responsibility when you can't deduct someone's pay. Firstly, that's a bit weird, right? Like, obviously, you could just divorce responsibility and say person X was responsible without dopping their pay. But the second thing is, board members are looking for someone to blame when big decisions go wrong. If the board can't point to a senior manager who made a bad decision or made that fuck up, then probably, the board themselves are going to get removed for not actually changing something about the company or carrying out action. So it's just wildly unclear to me how there is no, culpable responsibility or any of that takes place in the business. Just one note about how this is not intention, because their final argument was, well, why don't they remove underperforming CEOs? We tell you that there was a reasonably high bar to remove a CEO, right? Banks don't want to seem to be in turbulence, also want to be seen not in control of their company. That means that the marginal change we deliver you in this bank is these CEOs are less relentlessly driven to this profit target. They can miss a quarter and not feel bad about it, still get their compensation delivered to them in this. Yes,
If companies and boards want to be seen as being in control of their company, how then is one of your main accountability mechanisms of firing people with something that is less likely to happen when they value this so much?
Okay, just not the big risk they're talking about. So they're saying that the banks don't the risk they have in this bank is this bank's going to lose 100 or tens of millions of dollars on a bad bet. At that point, that's a pretty public failing, so the board has to be in control to deliver that. But that's sometime off in the future and doesn't necessarily happen that often. Finally, Kilvan gave us some material about consumer satisfaction and was like, well, they'll just give loans to these people. The first thing is we say to offer loans to more people. They probably offer them better deals to grow their customer satisfaction or their market share. Secondly, we say the impact of that is probably felt in the future anyway, right? The second year that you're into your predatory loan and now you can't meet your repayments, you probably score that bank a little bit lower on your customer satisfaction survey anyway. Let's talk about the outcomes of this debate. The note here, just basic lack of response to all of the analysis that we gave you about our central mechanisms of how this debate works. That means that if we win the incentive material, it's too late for Celine to come out and try and respond to all the material we gave you about how employees at banks act predatorily to consumers of those banks, all the misleading information that we gave you, and all of those problems. The one response we did hear from Karan was about the minimum equity requirements that exist. Firstly, we say that, yes, that exists in some markets, but not others. We see a huge undermining already of the regulatory framework in the US, where Trump refuses to appoint people to the Consumer Financial Protection Board, or the Republicans are seeking to disestablish that and roll back the types of protections delivered to consumers. But secondly, while there was an Australian Royal Commission, note the New Zealand Reserve Bank and the Financial Markets Authority have actually done nothing to regulate the same behaviour by the same banks own. We gave you the reasons about regulatory capture, why you simply cannot regulate these types of consequences out and you can't make it more stringent. The final thing that was unresponded to was we told you about how banks probably stopped servicing low-value consumers. They shut down branches that serve elderly people who for banking as essential services. They shut out consumers who otherwise need access to this essential service. Panel, just think about how this incentive operates, because I can't buy that the incentive is going to operate in that strange way that side negating wants to claim we propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech and welcome up the final substantive speaker of today's debate.
Look, we think it was quite telling when Shah answered my POI by not actually answering my POI and instead saying that I'm going to collapse the debate just down to one point of clash. Because that's exactly what I'm going to do right now. I'm going to tell you that all of the points that they told us about predatory banks, about how banks are going to become more nice now because there's no profit incentive, that's just completely ridiculous. That's just bullshit, right? Because we tell you that even if you yourself as an individual, you don't have the profit incentives, the bank itself still does, right? There's still pressure on you to get as much money as you can. If the board of directors know that you can make $500,000 a year by predating on elderly people, and suddenly you decide to stop because you want to be a nice person, they're not going to stand for it. They're just going to take you off CEO, and you know there's a line of people behind you who want the same job as you. We tell you that predatory behavior is something that's inherent in banks, inherent in all businesses. They don't actually stop it. So, two questions in today's debate. Firstly, how does this actually change the bank's incentive to make predatory loans and predate on elderly people? And then secondly, a question about how does this actually change the individual's perceptions of risk? Because, okay, first point of clash, how does this actually change the bank's incentives to make predatory loans? Because not what we actually got from 5 minutes of Umbar's speech. She told us that firstly, consumers were really important because they don't have information, they don't have financial capabilities, and so often you get predators telling them that they should get out a credit card when you go into the bank, and that's really harmful. But it's just completely ridiculous for her to come out and also tell us that the reason why this doesn't exist anymore is because there's no profit incentive on the individual CEO, right? Because even though it might be the case that your own individual, the amount of money that you earn isn't tied to how much money your bank makes, we tell you that there are still lots of other separate pressures that apply on you in order to get the same amount of profits, right? We tell you that it is the fact that stakeholders still really want you to get as much money as possible. Stakeholders are going to take you off the executives if you don't actually make as much money as possible, and since you do want to keep that really hefty check that you get every single year, you're still going to want as much money as possible. But the second thing that we tell you is we also tell you there's a lot of reputation risk involved with becoming a nice bank, right? Because like Umbar said, lots of CEOs are CEOs because they want to pad out their CV and go into another bank. So they want to prove to their future employers that they're able to do really, really profit-driven stuff. They're putting on your CV, I was the nicest bank in New Zealand, isn't going to get you anywhere. But putting on your CV, I was a bank that made the most money in the whole of New Zealand, and I was able to do XXX policy. That looks really, really great on your CV. Because the thing that they miss on their side of the house is this isn't a debate about regretting norms. It's not a debate about changing these norms. And instead, these norms already exist in society right now, right? So it doesn't matter that we take away the incentives, we take away the remuneration that you get that's tied to returns on equity, because these norms still exist. Stakeholders and shareholders, they still know that if you continue to do predatory behavior, you can make you can make a lot of money, and they're not going to be happy with you just deciding that you're going to be a nice bank now because you just want to be nice. This means at the end of this point, it is essentially a wash, right? On either side of the house, you're still going to have banks trying to make as much profit as possible, and they probably are going to rely on things such as predatory on elderly people. But instead, what we also told us is we have also told you that it's even worse, right? Carl literally told you at the point where you're tying the amount of pay that an individual CEO gets in order to consumer satisfaction, we tell you what makes people the most satisfied is when you have an elderly lady go to 5 different banks, none of them want to give you a mortgage, you go to a 6th bank and they give you a mortgage. You think they're really nice, right? You're like, that bank teller was so kind to me, she was taking pity on me because I couldn't afford a home and she gave me this money. That's when you do put the 5 stars on your consumer rating, and that's when CEOs know that they are going to get more money, right? So we tell you that on outside of the house, at the very least, you're going to censor yourself and the types of predatory loans that you make. You can't make loans that are way too predatory because you know they're just going to go bust. You know that means your bank is going to lose money. So there's something that's censoring you in that way. But we tell you if it's just tied to consumer satisfaction, no one's going to come back to your bank and fill out a survey 10 years later saying, oh no, I went bust, now I don't have consumer satisfaction. They fill out the survey right then when they get the loan. That's why you actually get more predatory loans, not less. Okay, but what is actually more important in today's debate? Our question about how does this actually change the individual's perceptions of risk? Because what they wanted to tell us on their side of the house is they wanted to say at the point where the CEO isn't tied to these type of things, this means that you don't have a perception of risk, and you're still going to get fired if you make risky bets, which is why you won't make them. But we think the problem with this though is at the point where the money that you're investing isn't actually tied to how much money you individually get. The calculus just changes, right? And we tell you the reason why this is so important is because banks have a really large pool of money behind them, right? It's not just one CEO who is investing money, and you have 20 other executives who are also investing money. So for the bank, when they actually think about it, if one executive loses money that year, they don't actually care that much. They're not going to fire you if one executive loses money because you have 19 other executives who are making money. So that means if you are an executive who makes really risky decisions, it probably doesn't matter because the bank doesn't really care if you lose that money. They know that in order to make lots of money, they need to have really big risks. So these banks usually are happy for you to take those risks in the short term because they have a large pool of money behind them to fund them with it. But the second thing that we tell you is that they want us to say that short-termist behavior was so harmful on their side of the house. We just don't think this is true. It also applies on our side of the house. It also applies on their side of the house as well, right? Because we tell you that shareholders themselves are also really short-termist, right? We tell you that you still get a quarterly report every year telling you about the financial situation of the bank. At the point where shareholders see that the bank is losing money, these shareholders are probably even more short-termist than the CEOs that we're talking about. So at the point where they see their bank is losing money, they're not going to be very happy about it. And we tell you that's when you're actually scared you might lose your jobs. We think that's why because of the really large pool of money that these banks have and the fact that banks are more willing to take risks. That's why we say that risky behavior is actually worse on our side of the house. But instead what we tell you that it gets better on our side of the house where the amount of money that you earn is actually tied to this, right? Because unlike banks, you don't actually have a really large pool of money behind you. So you're really scared about the fact that if something hits, let's say a pandemic hits, you're really scared about the fact that it could mean that you're going to lose your money. Unlike banks, you do have to be conservative because you don't have a large pool of money behind you. And instead, it's directly tied to your way that you live your life. It's directly tied to the things that you can afford. Because of that, we tell you that you change your calculus and you actually become less risky because it's tied to you as an individual and it's not just tied to your bank as a whole. The only response that we actually got was during Zach's speech when he wanted to say the reason why this is so harmful is because it's really short-termist and you don't see these ethereal long-term benefits. But that's just dumb, right? Because as a CEO, you do stay with that bank, or as an executive, you do stay at that bank not for 1 year, not just for 1 quarter, but you know you're probably going to stay in the next 10 years. This means that if you make an investment now, yes, it might be ethereal to think you could get an investment back in 10 years' time, but if you know it's 10 times the amount of bonus that you're going to get right now, you're probably still going to make it anyways. But the second thing that we tell you is we also tell you that we also tell you that there are other pressures on you to also make long-term investments also, right? Because we tell you that yes, your remuneration is tied to the short-term investments that you make, but there are also other things such as your reputation, such as your role as a CEO that is tied to the long-term investments that you make. Because at the point where a bank sees that you're only making short-term investments in order to increase the amount of pay that you get, but you're not making any sensible long-term investments, they'll probably just remove you as the CEO, right? We tell you you'll probably just lose your job, you'll lose your reputation, and that actually does mean you're not actually able to shift to another bank anyways. We tell you instead what's best is the fact that you're going to make the sensible returns. You're going to make sensible short-term, long-term returns. You know it's going to impact you as a person, not just this ethereal bank that you don't actually care about, and that's why you make the less risky decisions. Predatory behavior was a wash in today's debate.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech. Now turn to the leaders of my portion of the debate. I'd like to welcome up the leader of the engagement team.
that best case scenario relied on you believing that even when the shareholders are pounding on your door, asking why you're not taking that $500 million sitting on the table from the vulnerable old ladies, you would turn around and tell them, oh, I have the long-term health of the bank in my mind. I want us to have a nice reputation. I want the community to value us. That's not how bank CEOs think. They don't get that norm change they wanted to tell you about. A lot of the outcomes they claimed we didn't address are just contingent on who proves the incentives change. We change those incentives. We tip the balance slightly in favor of you making less risky decisions because the outcomes are felt by you. That's guaranteed. You don't have to rely on their mechanisms of maybe you get fired, maybe you don't. Okay, 2 questions then. Firstly, who changes the incentives? That's going to determine who wins the debate. Secondly, just talk a little bit about the predatory practices, why they're contingent on the first one. Okay, so incentives. The strongest content here was probably around short-termism. They claimed they were going to be able to change the norms because now there's no pressure for you to get that short-term bonus. The problem is that they were never able to prove that that norm came from the CEOs, right? We told you consistently that it comes from shareholders. You still have quarterly profit reports. You still have shareholders demanding profits. You have all the pressure from the board that flows down to the executives. So that schedule, the shareholders aren't bound by the long-term health of the bank, right? They just have to get that dividend in the short term, and then they can sell off the stock. So you still have a huge amount of short-term pressure in order to make short-term profits in order to get those. At most, maybe you get a small change when you're 1 month away from the reporting period, and you pull off some accounting tricks pull profits back. That's a tiny change. That's clearly not going to win them the debate because that's that's by its nature is the very last portion of a very small time period. It's not a huge change. Also, the final thing to note here is that, as Celine pointed out, they were never actually able to prove to you why, the extent to which short-termism is bad, right? Because the long term is just a series of short-term periods. So in the short term, it's profitable to make predatory loans to old ladies. That's also profitable in the long term. So a lot of the behaviors that you do are probably the same anyway. The extent to which they get marginal change or a marginally bad thing, that's a really incredibly small benefit for them in the debate. What did we say then? We told you that promotions are a far worse method, far worse incentive of you getting the benefits or a profit. That's because the downside to you, in the case where it does go wrong, in the case where you do something bad, it's far less likely. Maybe in the most egregious cases where the banking system collapses, a CEO does get fired, or a few exec members do get fired. That's only in the worst cases. We told you structural reasons why. In most cases, you are able to cover up those bad decisions. You're able to justify them, and the other members of the board are willing to cover for you. In comparison, it is guaranteed that you will lose money if you make a bad decision. You lose profits. That's not reliant on the goodwill of the board. That's not reliant on other executives holding you accountable, right? We told you they're more likely to hold you accountable because they don't want their pay to be cut. They want to assign the blame to you. That divides that old boys club. It forces them against each other, forces them to stab each other in the back. Finally, they told us that you don't think about the risk. Well, look, maybe that happens once, but once you've been burned, once you've been forced to take that pay cut, clearly that changes, and clearly you don't want that to happen again, right? You learn from the people above you who've gone through this. That norm flows down. Okay, predatory loans then, because a few points they wanted to claim we didn't engage with this. But the fact is we did. This is just an outcome, right? Clearly if the incentive on you is still to be profitable and the incentive is still to do all those things, you're still going to push really predatory loans. We gave you lots of analysis about how that's customers don't realize they're being predated upon, so they are happy. And so when you fill in that consumer survey, they want to tell you their alternative, you still get really good consumer surveys when you're being predatory. That's why we did address it, and that's why you can't win the debate. We tipped the balance of incentives so that you make less risky decisions, so that you hold yourselves and hold the other members of the executive board accountable. That's why you won the debate.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech and welcome up the final speaker of today's debate.
I think the negating team made lots of claims that were difficult to square up in this debate, because the first thing they said was that CEOs needed a lot of money to fund their lifestyles, so they want these bonuses. But also they'll skip these bonuses every now and then, which doesn't happen in status quo, but might happen in a few years, because why not? But also that missing your remuneration is a sign that you're not a good financial manager because you can't get consistent growth. But also, if the market is shaky, you will stop risky behavior despite all of the incentives acting in the other way. They didn't do the work to prove why all of these competing incentives could coexist. We, on the other hand, gave you clear mechanisms as to why, when you have short-term goals for profit, that's the profit you always chase. No one ever thinks that the one decision they make every quarterly term is going to be the decision that causes financial collapse. So the debate has to be won by the team that decreased that risk of collapse most. I don't think they ever did that in this debate. I'm going to talk about three things. Firstly, just examine the path to victory that they present and why they never walked that line. Secondly, talk about why incentives change. And lastly, just explain why predatory loans aren't symmetrical. They can't just say the word and claim that win. Let's look at their path to victory. Celine collapses the debate to whether just any risky decisions are made on either side of the house. The debate is a lot bigger than that, we tell you, but let's just talk about why they don't walk that path to success anyway. NEC can only win this debate if you buy that fixed remuneration encourages predatory behavior that doesn't currently happen under status quo, so increases that risk beyond what already happens. If you don't buy that analysis from them, the current predatory behavior that ruins lives continues. We think it's pretty sad if that kind of harm is allowed to continue in this debate. Let's look at exactly how incentives change. Because the incentives we tell you that act on you under status quo as a CEO are to meet short-term targets every quarter. And I think that's pretty clear down the line from our case. We give you lots of reasons why that short-term target becomes the most important thing in your mind beyond all the other risks they think are competing. Firstly, you never think you as the CEO are the one who is making a bad financial decision if your profit is still increasing. But importantly, the incoming 3 months will always be far more certain than an ethereal risk of financial collapse, because as long as you can meet that profit in 3 months' time and then meet it in 3 months' time again, that's a shorter term for you to think on. The risk is far more certain. The point of this material is if they want to win this debate on thinking about the risk of financial collapse and thinking about reputational damage that they hinge their case on, that is far more present under our side of the house. When you have more time to get growth, they don't engage with the fact that norm changes to allow for stable growth to be the only factor, not millions and millions and millions of dollars of growth every quarter, regardless of the financial status of the markets. Let's look then at why predatory loans are not symmetrical. And Zach tells you that CEOs are only fired when there is a significant loss incurred by a bank, not just when you could have made more money. The point is, in a world where remuneration is tied to profit, that's when you suffer a harm from not making the massive loans. We're able to just say, if you're making growth, that is something that is good for a bank. Note that you engage in predatory loans under their side of the house more than you do under ours. Given that on our side of the house, CEOs no longer have to worry about pay, but worry about the long-term brand, so the health and stability of their bank over long periods of time, on our side of the house, there is significantly far less pressure from shareholders to tell CEOs, you need to lend more predatory loans so we can push the profit margins for this quarter specifically. That is a norm that applies to the entire banking industry and changes behavior for all CEOs. We tell you at the point where fewer lives are destroyed, that is a win on our side of the house because predatory loans was something that both sides did not stand for. If you ruin people's lives and people can't repay those loans, that is when the boys clubs stab each other in the back. That's what they stood for in this debate. We were so proud to propose.
All right. Well done, both teams. Cross the floor, shake hands.
Because we lose the other room at 11.